What is the ultimate betrayal? Is it a stolen kiss, a whispered lie, or the cold, calculated act of erasing someone from your life? For Richard Smith, a man who built an emir of steel and glass, betrayal was a tool he wielded with precision. He had it all: a billion-dollar company, a glamorous mistress named Isabella, and a quiet, unassuming wife, Brianna, whom he planned to discard like a forgotten relic. He drafted a new will, leaving every penny, every stock, every last brick of his legacy to his lover. He thought he had sealed his future, but he never imagined that the wife he so casually dismissed was holding the one thing he couldn't control, the final key. The penthouse on Park Avenue was less a home and more a museum of Richard Smith's success. It was a cold, cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on New York City like a judgmental god. Every surface was polished marble or chrome. Every piece of furniture a minimalist statement that cost more than most people's cars. This was Richard's kingdom, and in it Brianna Smith often felt like a ghost. Richard was a titan, the Smith of Smith Ross Enterprises, a global real estate development firm that reshaped skylines. He was a man carved from ambition and arrogance, with a booming voice that commanded boardrooms and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was handsome in a severe way, with silvering temples that he believed lent him an air of distinction rather than age. His wife, Brianna, was his opposite. Where Richard was loud, she was quiet. Where he was steel, she was watercolor. She had a serene beauty with intelligent, kind eyes and a grace that seemed out of place in the harsh angles of their apartment. She held a master's degree in art history from Columbia, a fact Richard mentioned at cocktail parties as if it were an exotic accessory he'd acquired. He saw her as decorative, intelligent enough to be a presentable hostess, but docile enough not to challenge his authority. He had married her 5 years ago, believing her to be the perfect corporate wife, elegant, well-educated from a respectable, but he assumed modest family. A beautiful blank canvas on which he could paint his legacy. He was wrong. The third person in their silent, fractured marriage was Isabella Rossi. Isabella was everything Brianna was not. She was a fiery, ambitious art gallery owner from Soho, with a mane of dark hair, a wardrobe of daring couture, and an insatiable appetite for the lifestyle Richard provided. She was a mirror perfectly reflecting Richard's own ego and ambition back at him. He didn't just love Isabella, he loved the way she made him feel powerful, desired, and immortal. For the past year, their affair had been an open secret, a wound in their marriage that Richard no longer bothered to hide. He would take Isabella to the galas Brianna was supposed to attend, his hand possessively on the small of her back. He bought her a condominium in the very building his company had just completed, a glittering tower on the Hudson. He would leave the dinner table to take her calls, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that was louder and more insulting to Brianna than a shout. Brianna endured it with a quiet stoicism that Richard mistook for weakness. He saw her continued presence as proof of her dependency. Where would she go? What would she do? She was a Smith now. He believed the name, the comfort, the gilded cage he had built for her was enough to keep her silent and compliant. He had no idea that her silence was not submission, it was observation. One crisp October evening, the dynamic reached a new level of cruelty. Richard was hosting a dinner for potential investors from Singapore. Brianna, as always, had orchestrated the event flawlessly. The catering was exquisite, the floral arrangements were tasteful, and she moved through the room with an effortless grace, ensuring every guest felt welcomed. Richard stood by the fireplace, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, holding court. Isabella was there not as a guest, but as Richard's undeclared partner. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, deliberate contrast to Brianna's elegant but understated navy blue gown. "Richard, the new Hudson Yards project is simply visionary," one of the investors, Mr. Lim, was saying. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "We don't build buildings, Way. We build monuments. That's the Smith-Ross difference." Isabella slid her arm through his. "He's a genius. I'm constantly telling him he works too hard, but his passion is just intoxicating." She looked directly at Brianna, who was standing nearby, a small, polite smile fixed on her face. The look was a challenge, a declaration of victory. Brianna simply met her gaze, held it for a beat too long, and then turned to offer another guest a canapé. She didn't rise to the bait. She never did. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, the silence in the penthouse was thick with unspoken words. Richard loosened his tie, his mood expansive from the successful evening. Isabella was lounging on the white leather sofa, sipping champagne. Brianna was quietly directing the cleanup crew. "You can go, Maria," Brianna said softly to the head of the staff. "We'll handle the rest." Once they were alone, Richard turned to Brianna, his expression dismissive. "Brianna, you were a bit stiff tonight. You need to learn to relax. Look at Isabella. She's a natural. People are drawn to that kind of energy." Isabella preened, taking a deliberate sip of her champagne. "Darling, not everyone can be the life of the party. Brianna is more of the quiet support. Every king needs his loyal subjects, after all." The insult hung in the air, sharp and clear. Brianna carefully placed a stray glass on a tray. "I'm glad your evening was a success, Richard." Her composure infuriated him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted tears, a scene, something to justify his growing contempt. "Is that all you have to say? We're building an empire, and you're more concerned with the catering." "Someone has to be," she replied, her voice even. "An empire built on a shoddy foundation will crumble." Richard laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Don't try to be profound, Brianna. It doesn't suit you. My foundation is rock solid. It's made of steel ambition and my own 2 hands. Something you wouldn't understand." He walked over to the bar to pour himself another drink, his back to her. In that moment, watching him, Brianna felt not sadness, but a cold, hardening resolve. He spoke of his 2 hands, but he always conveniently forgot the other name on his company's letterhead, Ross. He never spoke of his original partner, the man who had provided the crucial seed money and the initial invaluable connections. The man Richard had pushed out and erased from the company's official history. Richard thought his foundation was solid, but he had forgotten or chosen to forget the very cornerstone it was built upon. And Brianna knew exactly where that cornerstone was buried. She looked from Richard's arrogant posture to Isabella's smug smile. They saw her as a spectator in her own life. Soon, very soon, they would learn she was anything but. The first tremor in Richard Smith's meticulously constructed world didn't come from his marriage, but from his own body. It started subtly, a persistent fatigue he blamed on overwork, a slight tremor in his hand he dismissed as too much caffeine. But then came the dizzy spells and a crushing headache that even his potent painkillers couldn't touch. A series of private MRIs and consultations with the best neurologists in the city led to a diagnosis that was as swift as it was brutal. Glioblastoma, an aggressive, relentless brain tumor. The prognosis was stark, 12 to 18 months. Maybe 2 years if he responded well to the experimental treatments. The news didn't humble Richard. It enraged him. He saw the illness not as a tragedy, but as an intolerable cosmic insult. The universe had dared to challenge him to put an expiration date on his reign. His ambition, already a roaring fire, became a desperate inferno. He didn't have years to cement his legacy anymore. He had months. His first call wasn't to his wife. It was to his lawyer. Arthur Vance was an old-school attorney from a prestigious firm, Vance & Harrington, LLP. He had handled Richard's affairs for 2 decades, drafting the ironclad prenuptial agreement Brianna had signed without question 5 years ago. His office was a sanctuary of mahogany, leather-bound books, and quiet competence. "I need to make some changes to my estate plan, Arthur," Richard said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion as he sat opposite the lawyer's imposing desk. He didn't mention the diagnosis. To admit to the illness felt like admitting defeat. "Significant changes. I want to draft a new will effective immediately." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Is Brianna aware of this?" "Brianna's awareness is not required," Richard snapped. "This is my fortune, my company, my decision." "Of course, Richard. What changes did you have in mind?" "I want everything," Richard said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a feverish intensity. "And I mean everything. My shares in Smith Ross, the portfolio, the properties in the Hamptons and St. Bart's, the art collection, all of it. I want it to go to one person, Isabella Rossi." Arthur Vance went still. He slowly took off his glasses and polished them with a silk handkerchief. He had seen messy divorces, bitter inheritance battles, and corporate takeovers, but this was a new level of cold-blooded. "Richard," he began, his tone measured, "to completely disinherit your wife is a drastic step. The courts will look at this with extreme scrutiny. Brianna could contest it on grounds of undue influence, especially given your relationship with Ms. Rossi. That's what I pay you for, Arthur, to make it incontestable. The prenup protects my assets acquired before the marriage, and everything since has been carefully firewalled in my name. Brianna is entitled to the settlement outlined in the prenup. $10 million. It's more than generous. She won't get a penny more." $10 million is a significant sum," Arthur conceded, "but it's a pittance compared to the value of Smith Ross. We're talking about an estate worth billions. A judge might see this as punitive." "Then find a way," Richard commanded. "I want clauses about her mental state. I want proof of my sound mind when signing. We'll get a psychiatric evaluation for me, the day of the signing. We'll videotape it. I want this thing so armored it would take an act of God to pierce it." While Richard plotted in law offices, Isabella was solidifying her position. She had become his shadow, his confidant, his self-appointed nurse. She learned how to pronounce the names of his medications. She scheduled his appointments with a hushed, reverent efficiency, and she expertly managed his moods. She framed her ambition as devotion. "Oh, Richard, you can't be worrying about work," she would murmur, massaging his temples as he lay on the sofa exhausted from a round of radiation. "You need to rest. Let me handle the calls. It's just, I built it all from nothing." He'd rasp, his voice weaker than he'd ever admit. "I can't let it fall into the wrong hands." "It won't, my love," she'd coo, her voice like honey. "It will be my life's mission to protect your legacy, to make sure the world never forgets the name Richard Smith." She played her part to perfection. She redecorated the penthouse, slowly replacing Brianna's subtle, elegant touches with her own bold, garish taste. She dismissed the household staff Brianna had hired, bringing in her own people. She was isolating him, creating a world where she was the sun, and he was the dying planet caught in her orbit. Meanwhile, Brianna continued to live in the guest wing of the sprawling apartment. Richard had told her during a brief cold conversation that he needed space to deal with some health issues. He didn't tell her it was terminal. He presented it as a temporary condition and his need for isolation as a medical necessity. He was building a wall between them, and Isabella was the chief architect. Brianna saw it all. She saw the new will documents left accidentally on Richard's desk. She saw the way Isabella's eyes lit up when she discussed Smith-Ross board meetings. She felt the shift in the household, the way the new staff looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. One afternoon, she found Isabella in the master bedroom, going through her jewelry box. Not Richard's, but Brianna's. "What are you doing?" Brianna's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Isabella didn't flinch. She held up a sapphire necklace, a gift from Brianna's parents. "Just tidying. So much of this is dated. Richard wants to build a new vault for my collection. We'll need the space." The implication was clear. "This is my room now. This is my life now." "That is my personal property," Brianna said, stepping forward. Isabella placed the necklace down with a dismissive clink. "For now, Richard is a very generous man, Brianna. But his generosity has its limits. He wants a partner who looks to the future, not one who clings to the past. You should think about your own future, a quiet one somewhere far away from here." That night, Brianna sat in her darkened room, the city lights glittering below. They thought she was a fool. They thought she was weak, passive, and defeated. Richard, in his arrogance and illness-fueled paranoia, was trying to erase her. Isabella, in her greed, was dancing on the grave of their marriage. But Brianna was not planning her retreat. She was planning her strategy. She made a quiet phone call, not to a lawyer, but to her father. "Dad," she said, her voice steady. "It's time. I think Richard is about to make a very big mistake." On the other end of the line, a calm, resolute voice replied, "I've been waiting for your call, sweetheart. The foundation is ready. Let him think he's in control. A man is never more vulnerable than when he's certain of his victory." Richard and Isabella were so focused on the will, on the inheritance, on the money. They were playing checkers. Brianna and her family were playing a much longer and more complex game of chess. And her next move was about to put them in check. With the new will signed, videotaped, and secured in Arthur Vance's vault, Richard Smith felt a surge of triumphant power that momentarily eclipsed the gnawing dread of his diagnosis. He had, in his mind, secured his legacy. He had cut out the dead weight of his marriage and anointed his true successor. Now he needed to make it public. He needed to present Isabella not just as his lover, but as the future matriarch of the Smith dynasty. The idea for a dinner party started as a whisper from Isabella. "Your parents need to see us together, Richard," she had murmured one evening. "They need to understand that I'm the one who will be by your side. For everything." Richard's parents, George and Marion Smith, were old money from Connecticut. They valued tradition, discretion, and appearances above all else. They tolerated Brianna's quiet presence and were quietly appalled by Richard's flagrant affair. But Richard, in his current state, saw their approval as a final stamp of validation on his new life plan. He decided on an intimate gathering. Just his parents, his younger sister Amelia, and her husband Mark. The venue would be the Pinnacle Club, a hyper-exclusive private restaurant on the 80th floor of a skyscraper. His company had built a place where the food was secondary to the breathtaking view and the palpable sense of power. The day of the dinner, Richard approached Brianna in the library where she was reading. He didn't sit. He loomed. "Brianna, I have a family dinner tonight," he announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "It's a private matter. I'd appreciate it if you made other plans." "A family dinner?" she asked, her voice neutral as she marked her page. "Am I no longer family, Richard?" "Let's not be dramatic," he scoffed. "It's just complicated. My parents are old-fashioned. I need to handle this delicately. We'll talk later." It was a lie, a flimsy paper wall to hide the truth he was taking Isabella. He just didn't have the courage or the decency to say it to her face. "I see," Brianna said, looking down at her book. "Well, I hope your dinner goes well." Her placid acceptance both relieved and annoyed him. It was yet another confirmation that she was a passive player in his grand drama, a character to be written out of the script with ease. That evening, the Pinnacle Club was at its most impressive. A private room had been reserved with a single long table overlooking the glittering tapestry of Manhattan. Richard arrived first with Isabella on his arm. She was a vision in black silk, wearing a diamond necklace he had just bought her, one that had once been intended for Brianna. George and Marion Smith arrived next. George was a stern, quiet man who looked perpetually disappointed in his son's lack of subtlety. Marion was a woman held together by pearls and social propriety. Their smiles were tight as they greeted Isabella. "Isabella, how nice to see you," Marion said, her eyes flicking over the ostentatious necklace. "It's so wonderful to see you both, too," Isabella gushed, kissing the air near Marion's cheek. "Richard and I are just so thrilled you could make it." She used the word "we" with a practiced ease, slotting herself into the family unit. Amelia and Mark were the last to arrive. Amelia, unlike her parents, had no filter. She gave Richard a look that could curdle milk. "Richard, Isabella." She nodded curtly. "Where's Brianna?" "Brianna wasn't feeling up to it tonight," Richard lied smoothly, gesturing for everyone to sit. "Now let's order some champagne. We have something to celebrate." The dinner was a masterclass in tension. Richard, fueled by a mixture of champagne and bravado, talked animatedly about the future of Smith Ross. He repeatedly directed the conversation to Isabella, praising her business acumen, her artistic eye, her unwavering support during his recent health challenges. "Isabella has been a rock," he declared, raising his glass. "In times of crisis, you learn who is truly there for you, who has the strength and vision to carry things forward. She understands the business. She understands me." George Smith simply stared at his plate. Marion picked at her sea bass. Amelia was texting furiously under the table. "In fact," Richard continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Isabella and I wanted to make our commitment to the future official." He opened the box. Inside was a canary diamond ring, so large it was almost vulgar. Gasps, not all of them happy, filled the silence. Isabella's eyes widened, and she feigned a tearful surprise she had rehearsed for weeks. "Richard, why, this isn't just a ring," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "This is a promise of a future. Our future." He was about to slip the ring onto her finger. The family was frozen in a state of horrified shock. This wasn't just an affair. It was a coup. He was deposing his wife in front of them, and then the door to the private dining room opened. A captain of the restaurant staff stood there, his expression professionally blank. "Mr. Smith, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have some guests who insisted on joining you." Richard frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "I'm not expecting anyone else. There must be a mistake." "I don't believe so, sir," the captain said, stepping aside. Into the room walked Brianna. She was not the subdued, quiet wife they were used to. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored ivory dress that didn't hide but rather accentuated the gentle, unmistakable swell of her pregnancy. It was a detail so shocking, so unexpected that for a moment no one could breathe. But she was not alone. Flanking her were two people nobody in the Smith family had ever met. On her right was an older Asian man with a quiet but commanding presence, his eyes sharp and intelligent behind stylish glasses. On her left was a woman of extraordinary elegance, her silver hair styled perfectly, her expression serene but unyielding. Richard stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. Isabella's perfectly made-up face went pale, the triumphant smile frozen, and then crumbling into disbelief. Amelia was the first to find her voice a choked whisper. "Brianna, you're pregnant?" Brianna placed a gentle hand on her stomach, her gaze fixed on her husband. "I am Amelia. About 5 months now. Richard and I were waiting for the right time to share the news." Her voice was calm, but it carried a clear, ringing note of authority. Richard finally snapped out of his stupor. "What is this, Brianna? Who are these people you were told to stay home?" Brianna's polite smile didn't waver. She gestured to the man beside her. "Richard, I don't believe you've ever been formally introduced to my father, David Chen, or my mother, Annalise." She then turned to Richard's parents. "George Marion, I'd like you to meet my parents." The name Chen hung in the air for a moment, meaningless to the Smiths. But then Brianna looked at Richard, a glint of steel in her eyes he had never seen before, and delivered the final devastating blow. "My mother's maiden name, Richard," she said, her voice dropping ever so slightly, "was Ross." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was heavier than the crystal chandeliers, deeper than the city sprawling thousands of feet below. The name Ross sunk into the atmosphere like a stone. George Smith, who had been in his son's business periphery for years, was the first to connect the dots. His face already grim turned ashen. "Smith, Ross Enterprises," he breathed, looking from the quiet, powerful man standing beside Brianna to his own son. Richard's face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind reeled trying to reconcile the image of his quiet, bookish wife with the bombshell that had just detonated in the middle of his life. Brianna's family was supposed to be insignificant. He had done a cursory background check before proposing he was a businessman after all. He knew her father was an investor, a private man who dealt in international finance. He'd assumed it was minor league old money, quietly managing its own decline. He had never in his wildest, most arrogant dreams imagined this. David Chen, the man Richard had believed was a ghost from his company's past, stepped forward. He didn't look at Richard. He addressed George Smith. "George," he said, his voice calm and even, betraying no hint of the drama unfolding. "It has been a long time. You look well." "David," George managed, standing up slowly. I had no idea." "That was the arrangement," David Chen said simply. He then turned his gaze to Richard, and for the first time Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with his illness. The man's eyes were like polished obsidian, revealing nothing but immense, unshakable power. "My daughter tells me you were celebrating a new future." Isabella, who had been frozen with the ring box, still open on the table, finally found her voice. It was shrill, laced with panic. "Who do you think you are? You can't just barge in here. Richard, do something." Richard looked at her, then back at Brianna and her parents. He was trapped a predator, suddenly finding himself in a cage he hadn't seen being built. "Brianna, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered. "You've been lying to me for 5 years." "Have I?" Brianna responded, her composure unwavering. "I told you my father was a businessman. I told you my mother's family had business interests in New York. You simply filled in the blanks with what you wanted to believe. You saw what you wanted to see Richard, a docile wife with no connections, no power of her own, a convenient accessory." She took a step closer to the table, her eyes sweeping over the horrified faces of the Smith family and landing on the gaudy ring in its velvet box. "You were celebrating your future," she repeated, her voice cutting. "A future built on lies, cruelty, and the delusion that you are a self-made man. You stand in a building financed by my family's capital, running a company started with my father's money. And you have the audacity to try and discard me and your own unborn child for this." Her gaze flicked to Isabella, a look of such profound contempt that Isabella physically recoiled. Annalise Chen, Brianna's mother, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of generations of wealth and influence. "We have been patient, Richard. We respected Brianna's wish to make her marriage work on her own terms. We watched you humiliate her. We watched you flaunt this affair. But trying to steal her child's legacy, that is where our patience ends." The word steal was a slap in the face. Richard's arrogance, his one constant companion, surged back. "Steal everything I have, I built," he roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the remaining glasses jump. "Your father was a silent partner. He put in money, I put in the blood, the sweat, the genius. He's been living off my work for 25 years. David Chen smiled a thin, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. "An interesting interpretation of our history. I recall providing not just the initial 70% of the capital, but also the political connections that secured your first 3 major zoning variances. The Ross name was my wife's, used to keep my family's profile low. I preferred to operate from the shadows. I trusted you to build the company, yes, but I never trusted you to be a good man. That is why I insisted on certain safeguards." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. Brianna answered for him. "He's talking about the foundation of your empire, Richard. The one you said was rock solid. It seems you never bothered to read the fine print of the original partnership agreement." Amelia, Richard's sister, finally stood up. She looked at Brianna, at her baby bump, and then at her brother with disgust. "A baby, Richard. You were going to disinherit your wife while she was pregnant with your child." She threw her napkin on the table and looked at her husband. "Mark, we're leaving." She walked over to Brianna, touched her arm gently, and whispered, "Call me," before walking out, her husband trailing behind her. Her departure broke the spell. Marion Smith burst into tears. "George, I feel faint. This is a nightmare." George helped his wife to her feet, his face a mask of shame. He gave his son one last look of profound disappointment. "You've created a mess, Richard. A mess I don't think you can clean up." He nodded respectfully to David and Annalise Chen and escorted his weeping wife out of the room. Now it was just them. Richard, a panicked Isabella, and Brianna flanked by the silent, imposing power of her parents. Richard sank into his chair, the full weight of his miscalculation crashing down on him. The pregnancy, her father, Ross. It was all connected. This wasn't a spontaneous act of defiance from Brianna. This was a carefully planned, perfectly executed counterattack. "So this is it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You came here to humiliate me." "No, Richard," Brianna said, and for the first time he heard a note of genuine sadness in her voice. "You did this to yourself. I came here to introduce you to your child's grandparents, and to remind you who I am before you signed away a future that was never yours to give." She turned, and without another glance at him or the woman he had chosen over her, she walked out of the room, her parents right beside her, leaving Richard and Isabella alone amidst the ruins of their celebration, the shattered glass on the floor, a perfect metaphor for their broken future. The fallout from the dinner party was immediate and catastrophic. The story, albeit in hushed and distorted tones, ripped through New York's elite circles. Richard Smith, the self-made tycoon, was not so self-made after all, and he had tried to publicly replace his pregnant wife, the secret heiress to his company's other half, with his mistress. It was a scandal of epic proportions, a cocktail of greed, infidelity, and breathtaking hubris. Richard, reeling from the public humiliation and the private terror of his new reality, tried to seize control. His first act was one of pure impotent rage. He had the locks on the penthouse changed formally, barring Brianna from the home she had already mentally left. His second act was to call his lawyer, Arthur Vance. "I want to file for divorce," Richard barked into the phone, pacing his office like a caged animal. "Immediately. And I want to sue her for fraud, for misrepresentation, for something. She lied to me for 5 years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice heavy with caution. "Based on what you've told me about last night, I believe our legal strategy needs to be re-evaluated. Aggression may not be our wisest course of action. I don't pay you to be wise, Arthur. I pay you to win. That will I drew up, is it still valid?" "The will pertains to your personal estate upon your death," Arthur clarified carefully. "But this changes the entire landscape of the marital assets. If her father is indeed the Ross of Smith Ross, then her claim to the company is not just as your wife, but as an heir to a founding partner. The prenup might not be as ironclad as we thought in this new context." "What do you mean?" Richard snarled. "I mean, Richard, that this is no longer a simple divorce. This is the potential dissolution of a founding partnership. I need to see the original corporate charter and the partnership agreement for Smith Ross immediately." But Richard's rage blinded him to reason. He saw Arthur's caution as weakness. "You're fired, Arthur," he spat. "I need a shark, not a damn librarian." He hung up and immediately hired a new lawyer, a notoriously ruthless litigator named Julian Croft, known for his scorched earth tactics and astronomical fees. Croft was a man who saw the law not as a system of justice, but as a weapon to be wielded. Meanwhile, Brianna was not idle. She moved into a beautiful brownstone in the West Village, owned by her family's holding company, Chen Holdings. The space was warm, filled with books and art, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness of the Park Avenue penthouse. She was surrounded by a team that moved with quiet, lethal efficiency. Her legal representation was not a single shark, but an entire ocean, the senior partners of Chen Holdings' in-house corporate law division, men and women who knew every comma and clause of the Smith Ross founding documents, because their firm had drafted them 25 years ago. The first shot was fired by Brianna's team. It was not a divorce filing. It was a formal petition for an emergency injunction barring Richard from making any significant financial decisions, sales or acquisitions related to Smith Ross Enterprises without the co-approval of a representative from the Ross interest, citing the original partnership agreement. Julian Croft laughed when he received the papers. "It's a scare tactic," he told Richard. "An overreach. A judge will never grant it. We'll crush them in court." They didn't. In a closed hearing, Brianna's lead counsel, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Evelyn Reed, presented the first few pages of the Smith-Ross partnership agreement. She calmly pointed to a section detailing the fiduciary duties of the managing partners to each other. She then presented evidence of Richard's erratic and punitive behavior, namely, the new will completely disinheriting his wife and unborn child, who represented the Ross lineage, arguing. It demonstrated a clear intent to harm the interests of the other founding partner's family. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, granted a temporary injunction. Richard was for the first time in his life no longer the sole king of his castle. He had to have his decisions co-signed by an entity he had tried to destroy. The battle then moved to the discovery phase. Croft, on Richard's behalf, demanded years of financial records from Chen Holdings, hoping to find some hidden leverage, some dirt to fling. Chen Holdings complied, drowning Croft's office in tens of thousands of pages of meticulously organized, utterly mundane financial data. In return, Evelyn Reed made a single simple request. "We require the original signed and notarized copy of the 1999 Smith-Ross Enterprises Founding Partnership Agreement." Croft and Richard searched the company's archives. They found copies drafts, but the original wet ink signed document was missing. After a frantic week, Richard's secretary remembered something. Years ago, Arthur Vance had insisted on holding the original document in his firm's secure vault for safekeeping. A court order later, Arthur Vance, now professionally obligated to comply, delivered a sealed briefcase to the judge's chambers. Both legal teams were present. Julian Croft was confident. "Whatever is in that document, a good lawyer can argue his way around it," he whispered to Richard. "It's just paper." Richard, looking gaunter and more stressed than ever, his illness accelerated by the conflict, nodded weakly. He had to believe Croft was right. The judge broke the seal and opened the file. Inside was a thick, leather-bound document. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. This was the blueprint of the empire, the scroll upon which Richard's entire life was written. He believed he was the sole author. He was about to discover he had misunderstood the very first sentence. Evelyn Reed stood her expression calm. "Your Honor, please direct your attention to Article 4, Section 3B of the agreement." The judge found the page. Croft and Richard leaned forward over their copy. Richard began to read the dense legal text, his eyes scanning the page, his breath catching in his throat. He had read this document before years ago, but he had skimmed over these sections, dismissing them as boilerplate. He had been a young, hungry man, focused only on the clauses about profit-sharing and operational control. He hadn't paid any attention to the section titled Legacy and Succession. He read the words and the floor fell away from his world. It was a clause he had long forgotten, a detail he had dismissed as a strange eccentricity of his quiet, cautious partner, a detail that was about to become the guillotine for his ambitions. It was the final key. The room was silent, save for the rustle of paper. Julian Croft read Article 4, Section 3B, then read it again, his shark-like confidence visibly draining from his face. Richard Smith felt the blood drain from his own, a cold dread creeping into his veins that was far more terrifying than his medical diagnosis. The clause was titled the Unbroken Partnership Clause. It was a complex multi-part provision David Chen, as Mr. Ross, had insisted upon at the company's inception. Richard remembered arguing against it, calling it unnecessary and sentimental. David had been unmovable. It was, he had said, a non-negotiable condition of his investment. Richard, desperate for the capital, had relented, never thinking it would ever apply. Evelyn read Brianna's counsel, read the key passage aloud for the court, her voice clear and precise. In the event of the death of a founding partner, she began, full control and voting rights of said partner's shares in Smith Ross Enterprises shall not pass to an heir designated by a will or testament. Instead, said shares shall pass directly and irrevocably to their legal spouse, provided the marriage is intact at the time of death. Croft let out a sharp breath. A spousal succession clause. Clever. But Richard and Brianna are in the process of divorcing. The marriage will not be intact. He looked at Richard with a glimmer of hope. But Evelyn Reed wasn't finished. Please allow me to continue, Mr. Croft. She cleared her throat and read the next part of the clause. Should the founding partner be unmarried, or in the process of legal separation or divorce at the time of death, or should the surviving spouse be deemed to have acted in a manner that brings public disrepute upon the company or its legacy control of the deceased partner's shares, shall automatically revert to the other founding partner or their designated heir. She paused, letting the words sink in. The trap was intricate, brilliant, and utterly inescapable. Let me summarize for the court, Reed said, her eyes locking onto Richard. Under this clause, if Richard dies while married to my client, Brianna, the daughter of the other founding partner, she inherits his entire 50% stake in the company. His will, leaving everything to Miss Rosie, is rendered completely irrelevant, as it pertains to the corporate shares, which constitute 95% of his estate. She took a breath. Now let's consider the alternative. If Richard proceeds with this divorce, the moment the divorce is finalized, he is unmarried. Upon his death, his shares would then automatically revert to the other founding partner's heir. That heir is also my client, Brianna Chen Smith. A choked sound escaped Richard's throat. It was a perfect checkmate. No matter which way he moved, he lost. If he stayed married, Brianna inherited everything. If he divorced her, Brianna inherited everything. But the true genius of the clause, the final vicious twist of the knife, was in the details. Furthermore, Evelyn Reed continued, there is the matter of my client's own inheritance. Brianna is the sole heir to the Ross interest, the other 50% of the company, held by her father, David Chen. However, that inheritance is also governed by this agreement. Let's imagine a scenario where Richard successfully and maliciously contested this clause. Let's imagine he somehow managed to divorce my client and assign his shares to Ms. Rosie before his death. She looked at the judge. The clause also protects the integrity of the partnership. It contains a morality provision, the very one I cited for the injunction. By publicly attempting to disinherit his pregnant wife and replace her with his mistress, Mr. Smith has already engaged in behavior that brings public disrepute upon the company. A case could be made that he has already voided his own standing as a legacy partner. In that event, a controlling interest could be seized by the Ross family to protect the brand. He thought he was playing for his half. In reality, his behavior has put his entire legacy at risk. Julian Croft was speechless. He looked at the document, at the signatures from 25 years ago. It was all there in black and white. David Chen hadn't just invested money. He had built a fortress around his investment and his family, and Richard had just spent the last year running headfirst into its walls. The final key wasn't just one clause. It was the entire architecture of the company's foundation. It was a legal masterpiece designed to protect the partnership from the one thing David Chen knew: he could never control Richard Smith's character. "The prenup," Richard whispered hoarsely to Croft. "What about the prenup?" Croft shook his head, looking utterly defeated. "The prenup governs personal assets in a divorce. This is about corporate governance and succession. It's a separate legal instrument that supersedes it entirely. The company's charter trumps your marriage contract, Richard. It always has." Richard finally understood. The penthouse, the art, the cash in the bank, that was all he could ever control. It was a fortune, yes, but it was pocket change compared to the colossal value of Smith Ross Enterprises. The company, the empire he thought was his, had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the partnership, a partnership whose future was now solely in the hands of the woman he had tried to cast aside. He looked across the room at Evelyn Reed, but he saw Brianna's face calm, intelligent, and resolute. He remembered her words at the dinner party. "An empire built on a shoddy foundation will crumble." He had laughed at her. He had thought his foundation was steel. He was wrong. His foundation was paper, and her name was on it. The judge, seeing the utter collapse of Richard's case, looked at his lawyer. "Mr. Croft, given this information, I suggest you and your client have a serious discussion about a settlement. A very, very generous settlement." As they left the chambers, Richard stumbled, and Croft had to grab his arm to steady him. The physical toll of the battle, combined with the progression of his disease, had ravaged him. He looked like a ghost, a pale imitation of the titan he had once been. The fight was over. He had lost everything before he was even gone. The final key had been turned in the lock, and he was on the outside looking in at a legacy that would never be his. The aftermath of the legal revelation was swift and brutal. The knowledge that he had been so utterly outmaneuvered that his life's work was built on a legal framework that had always favored his silent partner shattered what was left of Richard Smith's spirit. The rage and arrogance that had fueled him for months evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man confronting his own mortality and irrelevance. His shark of a lawyer, Julian Croft, seeing no path to victory and no more billable glory, negotiated a quiet, unceremonious exit. The divorce was granted, but the settlement was a world away from the pittance Richard had intended. On paper, Brianna received a substantial but not obscene sum. The real victory was not in the settlement, but in the corporate charter that remained unchanged. The company was secure. Her child's legacy was secure. The first person to abandon the sinking ship was Isabella Rossi. When it became clear that the billion-dollar inheritance had vanished, so did her devotion. Her cooing words of love and support were replaced by shrill accusations. "You told me it was all yours," she shrieked at him in the penthouse, surrounded by half-packed boxes of designer clothes and jewelry. "You promised me everything. I've wasted 2 years of my life on you." "I thought it was," Richard whispered from an armchair, looking frail and old. "I truly thought it was." "Well, you thought wrong," she spat, grabbing a new Hermes bag he had bought her. "I'm not going to be some glorified nurse for a broke, dying man." She left without a backward glance, the canary diamond ring conspicuously absent from her finger, likely already at a private auction house. Her departure was a quiet, pathetic end to the grand passion Richard thought he had found. He was left alone in the cold marble museum. He had built a king with no subjects and no kingdom. His health declined rapidly after that. The stress had accelerated the glioblastoma's merciless march. His parents and sister visited their faces etched with a mixture of pity and lingering anger. He had brought shame upon their family name, and while they would not abandon him in his final days, the warmth and respect were gone forever. Richard spent his last few weeks in a private hospice, the sterile white room, a far cry from the opulent world he had fought so hard to build. In moments of lucidity, he would stare out the window, replaying his life, wondering at what point he had made the fatal error. Was it when he underestimated Brianna? Or was it 25 years ago, when he had skimmed the fine print, so blinded by ambition that he failed to see the quiet wisdom of his partner? He died on a grey Tuesday morning in March, with only a paid nurse for company. His will was executed, leaving his personal assets a few $1 million, the penthouse, and some art, all that the prenup had cordoned off to Isabella. But by the time the lawyers contacted her, she had already moved on, attached to a new European billionaire, and barely acknowledged the news. Most of the money was devoured by legal fees and estate taxes. 6 weeks after Richard's death, Brianna gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him David, after her father, with the middle name Ross. She did not give him the name Smith. Brianna did not attend Richard's funeral. Instead, she spent the day in her warm West Village brownstone, holding her newborn son, looking toward the future. She had no interest in vengeance. Her victory was not in Richard's defeat, but in her own survival and the protection of her child's birthright. With the full transfer of Richard's shares, Brianna Chen Smith, in conjunction with her father, now held 100% of the company. Their first act was a symbolic and powerful one. They called an emergency board meeting. The name on the letterhead was changed. Smith Ross Enterprises ceased to exist. In its place, a new entity was born, the Chen Ross Group. It was a deliberate choice. It honored her mother's family, the silent founders, and her father's enduring legacy. It erased the name of a man who had tried to build an empire on a flawed character. Brianna did not retreat into the shadows. She took an active role as co-chair, proving to be a formidable and insightful leader. Her background in art history gave her a unique perspective on development. She championed projects that integrated beauty community and sustainable design, shifting the company away from Richard's cold, monumental style. She was respected not just for her name, but for her vision. One sunny afternoon, about a year after Richard's death, Brianna was in Central Park with her son. Little David was taking his first wobbly steps on the grass. She watched him, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. She had endured the ultimate betrayal, faced down a titan, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. She thought of Richard and felt a pang, not of anger, but of pity. He had been so obsessed with his legacy, with carving his name onto the sky. He never understood that a true legacy isn't built in steel and glass. It's built in people, in family, in the integrity you pass down to the next generation. He had sought to control everything, and in the end, controlled nothing. He thought he was writing the final chapter, but he was just a footnote in a story that was always truly hers. Brianna picked up her son, who gurgled happily in her arms, and held him close. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a testament to ambition and power. But for her, the whole world, the entire empire, was right here in her arms. She had held the final key, and she had used it not to lock a door on the past, but to open one to a brighter, better future. Brianna's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the wisdom to play the long game. She endured humiliation and betrayal, all while quietly holding the power to change everything. Richard, blinded by his own ego, built his empire on a foundation he didn't even understand, and it cost him everything. This story shows that character, foresight, and integrity are the most valuable assets of all ones that can't be bought, sold, or stolen in a will. What did you think of Brianna's strategy? Was it a masterclass in quiet revenge or a necessary act of self-preservation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen a situation where the most overlooked person turned out to be the most powerful? Share your story. And if you love tales of incredible drama and satisfying justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.